The first sign is always incredibly subtle. In the midst of a $1 million board meeting in Silicon Valley, a solitary thought inside the mind of Elias Vance seemed to suddenly crack in half. Perhaps it would have been brushed aside and considered a minor glitch, a strange, fleeting moment of dizziness caused by an overloaded work schedule. But then, a few days later, every warning system in his body simultaneously registered the exact same thing. His heart rate spiked, his chest tightened, and his stress levels surged to an absolute extreme. A phenomenon carrying an immense amount of suppressed energy was taking place right within his internal universe, followed by the echoing of muffled tremors. At first, it was very quiet, detectable only by the most delicate senses of the subconscious mind. Strange ripples of anxiety slipped beyond all patterns of rational control, an invisible threat looming ever closer. Gradually, however, it stretched from one end of his awareness to the other. It was as if it were slicing right through the perfect facade of a successful chief executive officer, vibrating with the most chaotic and primal energies. When that suppression backfired upon itself, it created a silent panic that possessed a destructive power more blinding than a supernova. And indeed, by the time those around him could recognize the collapse through his eyes, all efforts to conceal it had become far too late. Following that devastating shock, the world of Elias sank into a deafening silence, a boundless void where every sound of achievement and prestige was completely drained away. He hastily stood up from his expensive leather chair, walked out of the boardroom, and completely ignored the bewildered gazes of his associates that were glued to his retreating back. The transparent tempered glass office space surrounding him, which was once a proud symbol of power and absolute control, suddenly shrank into a suffocating cage holding a soul that was gasping for air. We often spend our entire lives building such invisible fortresses, convinced that the bricks of status can protect us from the fragility of human existence, but in reality, we are merely imprisoning ourselves within endless expectations. The legs of Elias unconsciously hurried down the bustling street, where unfamiliar faces were frantically chasing their own illusions of success. His trembling hand threw the phone, which was vibrating continuously with dozens of urgent calls, onto the passenger seat of his car, exactly like discarding a ruthless tracking device. The car engine roared, and he stepped on the gas, speeding off into the unknown, with no destination, no schedule, and no remaining formula that could be applied to the shattering taking place inside his chest. His American dream, perfectly programmed down to every line of code, had officially shut down, bringing with it the collapse of his most fortified belief system, forcing him to bare himself to the truth that no algorithm could ever measure the depth of emptiness inside an exhausted mind. The car sped along the dense fog of Highway 1, fleeing from the soulless algorithms and the cold glass skyscrapers of Silicon Valley. The centrifugal force of despair and a yearning to escape a fracturing ego urged Elias Vance to steer south, heading toward the Big Sur coastline, where rugged, pristine cliffs proudly reached out to meet the furious waves of the vast Pacific Ocean. The growling of the engine mingled with the sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore like a symphony of internal chaos, accurately reflecting exactly what was unfolding in his mind. We often have the habit of deluding ourselves that all problems of existence can be solved through clear, logical steps, that simply reading a few more self-help books, installing a few more habit tracking apps, or applying some optimal management model will perfectly patch up the soul. Modern society constantly brainwashes us with the cruel belief that the human mind is merely a complex biological machine, and once that machine shows signs of malfunction or stagnation, we simply need to find the exact faulty line of code to delete it. Yet, at the very moment his wheels rolled along these winding coastal roads, isolated amidst majestic nature, Elias suddenly and bitterly realized the cruel paradox that he could never self-optimize or repair this extreme panic using those inadequate mechanical tools. The turmoil tearing at his chest was not a software bug needing to be uninstalled, but rather the primal scream of a natural living being rebelling against the grip of a fake ego that he himself had molded after decades of pursuing prestige. The more he tried to use willpower to suppress the anxiety, the more he resembled a madman swinging a hammer at the surface of a lake in the hope of flattening the ripples, resulting only in the water boiling, shattering, and becoming exponentially more violent. Unable to endure further confinement in his expensive vehicle, he hastily pulled over onto a quiet trail, taking exhausted, disoriented steps guided by the aimless pull of his instincts. He wove through the ancient, moss-covered pine trees, allowing the salty ocean air and the biting chill of the fog to pierce his costly, now useless suit, awakening patches of feeling that had long been paralyzed beneath his flawless exterior. Then, as if by a spontaneous arrangement of the cosmic current, steering a man drowning in the illusion of control toward absolute stillness, his feet led into a quiet, rustic wooden cabin nestled on the edge of a deep abyss, entirely separated from the noise and toxic expectations of the civilized world. Right at this precarious border between the earth, the sky, and the vast ocean, he chanced upon Dr. Evelyn Shaw, a woman who had reached the age of 68 yet carried an extraordinarily otherworldly aura. She did not bear the hurried look of those racing against time, nor did she wear the ironclad defenses of a stranger in the wild. Instead, she calmly and leisurely watered the wild sage bushes growing by her porch drop by drop, a seemingly meaningless action that embodied a complete harmony with the breath of the surrounding nature. Every movement she made exuded the gentle grace of pure presence, striving for nothing, expecting no future outcome. The eyes of Evelyn looked up at the strange man tearing apart from the inside, yet it was not a gaze of scrutiny, judgment, or surprise at the pathetic state of a fleeing executive, but rather a profound stillness like a tranquil autumn lake untouched by worldly sorrows. The moment those eyes met the sheer panic of Elias, he felt a strange suspension in space, as if his desperate resistance and noisy inner turmoil had struck a buffer of unconditional acceptance, where the invisible cages of power, optimization, and the need for control completely lost their value and meaning. In stark contrast to the tightly coiled defensiveness ready to erupt from Elias, Evelyn did not utter a single probing question about his identity, his profession, or why he currently looked as pitiful as a lucky survivor, washed ashore after a brutal shipwreck. She set her watering can aside, smiled softly, and warmly invited the stranger into the cozy space inside the wooden cabin, which was fragrant with pine and morning mist. Without a word of judgment or pressure, she slowly boiled water and prepared him a steaming cup of herbal tea, placing it into hands that were still shaking from the remnants of his panic attack. The heat rising from the water, carrying a gentle aroma, seeped into the frozen corners of the soul of Elias, forming a fierce contrast to the indifferent coldness of the vast universe outside and the arid technological world he had just escaped. Taking a sip of the tea, the frantic pounding in his chest seemed to be soothed by the pristine serenity radiating from every gesture of this peculiar woman. Throughout that wordless moment of sharing tea, there was no attempt to fill the void with empty social pleasantries. We rarely allow ourselves to sink into silence with another person without feeling anxious, for silence often strips away the verbal shield our ego uses to mask its insecurity. Yet the quietness of Evelyn possessed a deeply comforting quality. Through the stories that later flowed slowly like a gentle stream, she casually revealed a past immersed in grand equations, back when she was a distinguished professor of astrophysics at Stanford University, basking in academic glory, before she decided to leave the noisy scholarly world behind to seek tranquility on the edge of this abyss. The scope of the conversation gradually shifted from the narrow chaos inside the mind of a broken executive to the majestic vastness of nature and the distant stars. That open, weightless atmosphere inadvertently unfastened the last layer of armor protecting Elias, prompting him to confess the darkest corners he had never dared to admit to anyone, even to himself. His voice grew hoarse as he recounted the suffocating feeling of watching everything around him silently crumble from within, even though he had perfectly and absolutely followed every formula, every conventional process for success outlined by society. We are often programmed to blindly believe in an unchangeable life equation, convinced that if we study hard, dedicate ourselves fully, and manipulate time to reach the pinnacle of success, the inevitable reward will be peace and profound happiness. However, we forget the harsh truth that the essence of this reality does not operate according to logical spreadsheets or rigid human algorithms. Elias had spent decades building an empire upon the foundation of absolute control, brushing aside all natural emotions and any spontaneous weakness, solely to forge himself into a perfect profit-making machine. But now, sitting across from a former astronomer who chose to cast away the theoretical sky in exchange for the grounded present, he bitterly realized that very glittering empire was the darkest dungeon imprisoning his internal freedom. His exhaustion did not stem from doing the steps in the success manual incorrectly, but ironically, it came from doing what was expected far too right, far too perfectly, to the point of completely losing the ability to feel his own heartbeat. His deeply agonizing confession fell into the quiet space of the wooden cabin, meeting absolutely no pity or the familiar, hollow self-improvement advice. Instead, it was only received by the penetrating gaze of Evelyn. She simply sat there, holding her teacup, like a silent manifestation of a forgiving universe, without making the slightest attempt to fix the cracks in his narrative. Because, with the perspective of someone who had once peered through the stars, she understood better than anyone that sometimes, right within the desolate collapse of our strongest illusions, the light of truth finally has the chance to seep through, liberating us from the trap of a life designed far too perfectly yet devoid of the breath of true living that in response to the choked confession of Elias, Evelyn slowly placed her empty teacup onto the rustic wooden table, her eyes gazing distantly through the window toward the fog-shrouded ocean. In a warm, deep tone that carried the resonance of ancient stars, she began to guide him back in time to the furthest origins of all existence, introducing a profound physical concept about the dawn of everything to illuminate the tangled mess within the consciousness of the man sitting before her. The early universe, in the very first moments of the Big Bang, was once a realm of infinite perfection, symmetry, and scorching heat, where all natural laws and fundamental forces merged into an entirely flawless whole. In that brilliant, primal state, there was no division, no contradiction, and everything blended together in a stream of pure energy. Yet, following an inevitable law of eternal transformation, as the universe began to expand and cool over the ages, that initial perfect symmetry had to be broken to make way for the formation of diversity. She turned slightly to look directly into the weary, bloodshot eyes of the powerful executive, gently comparing the current state of the mind of Elias to a drop of water slipping out of equilibrium to freeze into cold blocks of ice. In its natural liquid state, water carries an absolute flexibility, a perfectly symmetrical beauty, and can freely morph into any shape without meeting a single barrier, much like our pure ego when we are first born. But then the invisible, heavy pressures of civilized life arrive, and the cruel societal expectations regarding success, fame, and power act as a brutal blast of freezing air, forcing the natural, peaceful flow within him to gradually crystallize into rigid formations. We continuously mold ourselves into jagged blocks of ice bearing names like social status, family duty, and the ideal model of a perfect citizen, convinced that this artificial solidity will help us withstand the fragile, impermanent nature of human life. The tragedy is that, as these cognitive blocks of ice hastily freeze at completely different times and in entirely different directions under the pressure of greed and fear, they will never, ever smoothly fit together. On one side is the image of a tireless, successful man always yearning to push forward, while on the other side is an arid, bleeding soul screaming for the right to be weak, the right to rest. On one side is the desire to control absolutely everything, to cling to a sense of safety, while on the other side is the primal instinct thirsting for the freedom to drift and wander along with all things. Where these rigid, opposing crystalline blocks collide, scrape, and compress against one another, they create deformed folds, horrific tears in space-time hidden deep within the consciousness that astrophysicists often refer to as cosmic strings. These invisible strings, though thinner than a subatomic particle, carry a mass equivalent to thousands of galaxies, and they are silently generating a massive, persistent tension that is tearing apart his perfect exterior from the inside out. The extreme panic, the absolute exhaustion, and the suffocating feeling that he might lose his life, which Elias was enduring, were in no way signs that he was a weakling, a failed individual, or a broken biological machine needing to be reprogrammed. Instead, it was the primal, destructive power born from the deep fissures between irreconcilable inner dimensions screaming to be set free. We constantly harbor the misconception, seduced by the illusions of our era, that we can use cold reason to fill those cracks, employing countless material achievements to polish the surface of the iceberg, pretending that the structure underneath remains completely whole. But the truth is that the tension of the cosmic strings in the mind never naturally vanishes. It accumulates day by day, month by month, if we blindly continue to force ourselves to maintain shapes that defy nature. Listening to every unhurried yet razor-sharp word that felt like it was dissecting the very root of his soul, Elias felt a cold shiver run down his spine, not out of fear of lofty theories, but because for the first time in a lifetime of exhausting himself chasing empty dreams, he saw his chronic illness explained with total clarity. It was not defined by dry medical terms, nor was it judged by the cliched psychological advice that demands relentless upward effort, but rather it was illuminated by the grandest, most authentic, and most ruthless law of the vast universe itself. Right as the echoes of understanding began to shine into his darkest corners, the instinct of a brilliant chief executive officer within Elias immediately flared up like a conditioned reflex, rooted far too deep in his marrow. Instead of allowing himself to bathe in the relieving liberation that the truth had just provided, his brain, accustomed to analyzing and solving problems, instantly activated its troubleshooting mode, stubbornly demanding a detailed action plan. His voice flashed with the familiar impatience often seen in tense boardroom meetings, hurriedly pressing Evelyn for an error-correcting equation, an optimal algorithm, or any secret meditation method that could instantly patch the bleeding space-time tears in his mind. His desperate resistance revealed a burning desire to force everything back into its old orbit, so he could quickly restore his authoritative shell and resume being a flawless money-making machine. We are always trapped in such a ridiculous paradox, continuously viewing mental pain, anxiety, or burnout as a foreign pathogen that must be eradicated at all costs, a bug in the software system requiring an urgent patch so the grand machine can continue running smoothly without paying any mind to the endurance of the hardware. Hearing the plea for a mechanical solution from Elias, Evelyn showed no surprise but merely let out a soft chuckle, a witty, gentle smile that was powerful enough to collapse the final efforts to cling to the illusion of control of her broken guest. She slowly poured a little more hot water into his teacup, gently explaining that the shattering he was experiencing was not a disease needing to be cured, nor was it a technical error requiring a fix. On the contrary, it was the incredibly healthy, instinctual scream of a natural self that had been squeezed and imprisoned for far too long beneath layers upon layers of artificial expectations named success and responsibility. When we try to use the massive willpower of reasoning to suppress imperfection, we are only channeling more energy into the cosmic strings that are waiting to explode, making the fissures even deeper and their destructive force even more catastrophic. The stubborn pursuit of a sharp tool to tighten the loose screws in the soul is actually just another sophisticated trick of the ego to maintain its absolute dominance over the fragile living entity inside, refusing to accept the natural laws of decay and rebirth. Evelyn tenderly directed her deep gaze into the profound confusion of Elias, offering him a groundbreaking first dose of philosophical first aid, which was an invisible command demanding that he immediately drop the weapon named control. She advised him to immediately stop the act of torturing himself with the desire to mend everything to perfection, because the true beauty of this universe and of humanity itself has never resided in unblemished wholeness. For genuine healing to have a chance to sprout from the ashes of a collapse, the essential first step is not to strive to do something grander, nor to shoulder yet another heavy spiritual practice, but rather to learn how to do absolutely nothing. Liberation comes from the moment we calmly accept the presence of the cracks, honoring them as an obvious testament that the rigid structure of illusion is breaking apart to let the light of truth flood in and illuminate us. The true peace that humanity endlessly pursues has never laid in possessing a flat, soulless mind like a dead lake. It forever resides in the ability to calmly embrace the imperfections of human life, allowing oneself to be weak, allowing oneself to fracture, and taking honor in being a flesh and blood human being, learning to dance with internal chaos instead of blindly drawing a sword to fight it. Night gradually descended, blanketing the cliffs of Big Sur, bringing with it the primal chill of the mist and the profound solitude of the wild nature. Lying alone on a coarse fabric mattress in the guest room, which was steeped in the scent of pine wood of Evelyn, Elias found himself completely stripped of all defensive weapons, left naked to face the silent darkness surrounding him. With no blinding fluorescent lights of skyscrapers, no thick stacks of financial reports, and no urging phone rings to serve as a refuge to distract his mind, he could now only hear the ceaseless murmuring of the waves crashing against the ancient cliffs, like a cruel, rhythmic heartbeat of eternity. It was exactly in that space of absolute stillness, where there was no harbor for frantic busyness, that the chronic disease named overthinking began to stretch its limbs, awaken, and frantically attack him from every direction. We often naively consider the night to be a peaceful sanctuary after a long, exhausting day, but for a mind that is fracturing and has lost its anchor in the present, the darkness morphs into a massive projection screen, the most perfect canvas for the subconscious to freely broadcast horrifying films of regret. That the sharp shards of memory, the sins he had labored to bury and seal tightly beneath the deep layers of his fortified successful executive facade, now rushed back, vivid and sharp down to the smallest detail. The image of his 17-year-old daughter Lily, with her thin, trembling shoulders turning away right at her own birthday party, a tear rolling down her face as her father missed yet another promise due to an urgent, unmissable stock valuation meeting, appeared brilliantly and stabbed straight into his chest like a poisoned spear. Close behind the lonely silhouette of the child was the cold, disappointed, and resigned gaze of his ex-wife on the day she dropped her pen to sign the divorce papers, a look that did not scream in resentment but rather contained the utter devastation of someone who had completely run out of hope for change. That cruel torment and sticky sense of guilt quickly intertwined, crystallizing into an invisible, brutal hand that choked his breath once again, dragging him down into the depths of a panic-stricken abyss. He curled up under the thin blanket, cold sweat soaking his forehead, desperately feeling waves of anxiety searing through his veins, eroding the last bit of grip on the calmness that the advice of Evelyn had brought him earlier that afternoon. This intense mental agony did not come from some external disaster striking down upon him, nor was it a physical threat lurking outside the door, but it was produced and nurtured by the very tireless cognitive machine inside his skull. The ego was frantically rewinding and replaying past mistakes, shredding every moment of trauma to analyze and magnify the errors, weaving for itself an invisible prison, locking its own master in eternal punishment. The more Elias tried to brace himself and use logical thinking to fight back, the more he tried to invoke career-related reasons to justify the absence of a father and a husband, the tighter the tangled mess in his head became. The restlessness of his mind at that moment exposed a tragic illusion that humanity always falls into, which is the blind belief that we can use thoughts to untangle the very suffering created by thoughts. It is exactly like an insane paradoxical loop, where a knife desperately twists to try and cut itself, or a set of teeth frantically bites into nothingness in an attempt to chew itself. While thrashing and gasping for air in the pitch-black ocean of self-judgment and profound remorse, Elias felt down to his marrow the absolute impotence of what is called willpower, bitterly realizing that trying to use reasoning to destroy the ghosts of the past is as hopeless as a person trying to use their breath to blow out a hurricane, only draining the last drop of vitality and pushing oneself deeper into an inescapable chaos that the pale light of dawn the next morning struggled to pierce. Through the thick fog hanging over the cliffs, bringing a stillness that completely contrasted with the fierce storm that had just swept through the mind of Elias Vance. He stepped out of the guest room with eyes lined with the blazing red streaks of exhaustion, his posture as haggard as ruins after a brutal war with his own shadows. Sitting down on the rustic wooden chair next to the crackling fireplace, he wearily recounted to Evelyn a night of absolute terror, where the tormenting memory fragments of his daughter Lily and his ex-wife had returned to tear him apart down to the bone. Instead of showing pity or panicking to find a way to soothe the bleeding pain of the poor man, Evelyn merely smiled gently, a kind smile that saw through all the impermanence of life. She slowly poured him a cup of warm ginger tea, and then, in a deep voice carrying the echoes of ancient mythological tales, she began to tell him about a terrifying creature named the Balrog. In the great fantasy legends, the Balrog are latent monsters wielding massive, destructive power from the primeval universe, having sunken into a deep slumber far beneath the darkest geological layers many thousands of years ago. However, it was the bottomless greed of the miners, who intentionally dug too deep into the earth to search for sparkling veins of gold, that accidentally awakened these bloodthirsty ancient ruins, bringing an apocalyptic disaster to the entire kingdom. The gaze of Evelyn, gentle yet sharp as if wanting to peer right through the soul of Elias, softly pointed out that the suppressed psychological traumas, the masses of regret, and the feelings of guilt accumulated inside him over many decades were exactly like the Balrog monster sleeping peacefully in the deep mines of the subconscious. We are constantly taught and brainwashed by a culture that glorifies the power of reason, convinced that we must bravely confront, clearly analyze, and use sharp logical thinking to excavate the root of all inner problems to permanently eradicate confusion or regret. But alas, the very desire to master and understand everything through mechanical thinking is the fatal pickaxe strike that awakens the fury of the monster. When Elias lay tossing and turning in the dark, desperately using cold logical arguments to determine right from wrong, using harsh judgment to dissect his wrong decisions in the past to seek a fake sense of peace, he was in fact not healing or solving anything at all. On the contrary, the more stubbornly he used willpower to destroy his anxiety, the more he resembled greedy men frantically digging deep into their own dark gold mines, inadvertently pumping abundant life energy into the depression monster, allowing it to stretch its limbs and rise up. That monster does not feed on flesh and blood. It is nourished and swelled by fear, fierce resistance, and the burning desire to control the situation of a proud ego. By attempting to fix an unchangeable past, he had brought disaster upon himself with his own hands, turning a sad event that was originally just a motionless remnant into a living beast frantically destroying the present. A spark of enlightenment suddenly flashed in the tired eyes of the executive, a moment of absolute stillness when he shockingly realized that the entire psychological defense strategy he had employed for years was completely a disastrous mistake. The more he fought, the deeper he sank into the swamp. The more he wanted to use logic to suppress the trauma, the more the trauma fought back with a primal strength multiplied 100,000 times over, because darkness can never be dispelled by taking another sword of darkness to slash at it. The arrogance of the intellect always tricks us into believing that if we can meticulously explain the cause of the pain, we will automatically gain mastery over it. Yet, Trying to logically deduce a primal emotion is no different from using a microscope to try and listen to a symphony. It is completely flawed in its frame of reference. Elias was so used to using charts, data, and fiery debates to win on the battlefield of business that he brought that exact lethal weaponry into his internal battlefield. He had turned the memories of Lily and his ex-wife into dark psychological mines, and night after night, he hauled the pickaxe and shovel of torment down there himself, telling himself he was searching for the pure gold of understanding, but in reality, he was only disturbing wild forces that were beyond human control. Those monsters of panic and anxiety were an inevitable part of the mental landscape. They did not represent corruption or weakness. They were simply the massive remnants of a soul that had once been bent out of shape by overly grand expectations. Evelyn took a sip of tea, allowing the powerful silence to cover the room, creating the space for this fresh realization to soak deep into every aching cell of Elias. She was gently peeling away his final layer of prideful armor, showing him that true liberation never comes from a bloody holy war with one's own shadows. Abandoning the desire to eradicate internal flaws is not a cowardly surrender, but rather a profound philosophical awakening. Amidst the serenity of the misty cliffs and the relentless crashing of waves below, a new concept began to form in the broken consciousness of the powerful executive, a bitter yet freeing acknowledgement that all efforts to forcefully intervene in the natural process of suffering were merely a ridiculous play directed by the ego to maintain the illusion of its limitless power. And it was time to drop the curtain on that cruel play to let the ancient beasts return to their inherent stillness. After a silence long enough for the brutal truth about his self-destructive habits to sink deep into the awareness of Elias, Evelyn leaned in slightly, her eyes gleaming with the wisdom of a guide who had passed through all the storms of human existence to reach the realm of tranquility. In a voice that was soft yet carried immense weight, she began to impart to him a method of approach that was completely opposite to the rigid management principles of the West, an ancient philosophical concept from Taoism known as Wu Wei. We, the people of the industrial age who are obsessed with having to intervene, to fix, and to manipulate everything, often misunderstand Wu Wei as lazy fatalism or a cowardly surrender, but in reality, it is the art of effortless action, the most refined form of going along with the laws of nature. She gently advised Elias that when the monster of panic inside begins to roar, churning up flames of torment and anxiety, the most foolish thing he could do is to put on armor, draw a sword, and rush into a life or death battle with it. Instead of frantically trying to extinguish the panic with logical commands, take a step back, drop all the weapons of reason, and simply observe it the way a silent mountain observes a passing storm. A weather phenomenon, no matter how stormy or how terrifying the lightning may be, is still only a temporary event happening against the backdrop of the sky. The sky is never damaged or shattered by the storm, and our primal mind is just as vast and unchanging as that very sky. Following that enlightening instruction, Elias slowly stood up, carrying his exhausted body out to the precarious cliff edge, where the winds carrying the salty taste of the Pacific Ocean were howling and weaving through the rough cypress branches. He discarded his expensive, cumbersome coat, awkwardly sat cross-legged on the grass damp with night dew, closed his eyes, and began to experiment with surrendering the entire weight of his body as well as the chaos of his mind to the forgiving earth. At first, the controlling habit of a chief executive stubbornly held on his brain continuously sent out emergency warning signals, urging him to open his eyes, to plan for tomorrow, to analyze the risks of silence, and to find a way to make amends with his daughter immediately. We are always imprisoned by the illusion that we are that incessant, chattering voice in our heads, convinced that if we stop thinking, we will fade into nothingness. And then, as an inevitable part of psychological workings, a dark, tormenting thought loomed up, bringing with it the image of the disappointed eyes of his ex-wife, trailed by the familiar piercing pain in his chest and the cruel suffocation waiting to swallow him into the swamp of panic. but right at the thin boundary between wakefulness and the habit of automatic reaction, instead of panicking, struggling, or trying to chant positive mantras to crush the negative thought as he usually did, Elias chose to completely let go of all resistance. He simply stood quietly in the position of an objective witness, a silent spectator looking straight at the hideous shape of the ghost from the past that was screaming for the right to exist and dominate. Miraculously, when it no longer received an abundant source of life energy from the resistance or fear of its host, the black cloud of regret suddenly stopped, hovered in mid-air, and then slowly dissolved into harmless specks of dust falling away into nothingness. For the first time in an adult life that had always been tense with the pressure to be perfect, a relieved smile unconsciously bloomed on the lips of the haggard man, not the triumphant smile of someone who had just defeated an enemy, but the free smile of a prisoner who had just realized the door to his cell was never locked in the first place. He thoroughly grasped the obvious truth that the thoughts torturing him were not reality. They did not possess a fixed self, but were merely an elaborate illusion crafted by his own proud ego to maintain its sense of existence and control. The pain still lingered somewhere, the regrets still left traces, but they were no longer a bloodthirsty primal monster ready to tear him apart, but simply waves of impermanent energy rising and falling away in the vast ocean of consciousness. This gentle letting go did not bring about a miracle that wiped the past clean or altered physical reality, but it instantly brought an ultimate liberation, completely severing the chain reaction of panic, leaving within the chest of Elias a space of stillness, crystal clear and wide open, just like the vast sky brilliantly welcoming the first rays of the morning sun. That even though he had experienced the enlightening moment of letting go on the cliff and felt the rare relief when the ghosts of the past temporarily stopped screaming, Elias Vance still could not completely dispel the feeling of emptiness that was coldly taking deep root in his chest. The tranquility of Big Sur had helped him neutralize the acute panic attacks, but at the same time, it stripped bare another cruel truth that he had long used his busyness to cover up, which was an ultimate sense of feeling lost and profoundly lonely. Standing amidst the vastness of nature, separated from profit figures and million-dollar contracts, he realized he was just a pathetic failure in every effort to genuinely connect with his fellow human beings. He had successfully built a glittering tech empire, but had completely lost the ability to build a home. He had hundreds of employees ready to follow his orders, yet he did not have a single person to share his fears within the dark of night. His prideful ego, though it had surrendered its weapons before past traumas, now pivoted in a different direction, isolating itself with the toxic belief that his pain was unique, that he was a deviant individual who had to bear a justified punishment for his own heartlessness all alone. That night, when the sky over Big Sur was completely clear of clouds and gave way to a breathtakingly brilliant carpet of stars, Evelyn quietly stepped out of the cabin, bringing along a large telescope that she had preserved from her time as an astronomer. She said nothing, only gesturing for Elias to come closer and guiding him to look through the lens. Contrary to his expectation that she would show him a famous constellation or some sparkling nebula to comfort him, the lens was pointed directly at a dark, profound patch of space that seemed entirely empty between the stars. The initial disappointment was quickly replaced by an indescribable feeling of bewilderment as Elias strained his eyes to look into that endless void, where even light seemed to be swallowed up. We tend to focus only on the bright, shining points, the tangible achievements that stand out on the canvas of life, while completely ignoring the silent spaces, the dark voids that make up the vast majority of existence. The voice of Evelyn rang out warmly in the deep night, breaking the tense silence, as she gently explained that the dark patch she thought was nothingness was actually not empty at all. Hidden deep within that magnificent darkness was a network of invisible cosmic strings, massive tears in spacetime silently weaving and twisting together to form a grand foundational structure that supported all the glowing galaxies. She smiled, saying that the fractures in his soul, the loneliness and disillusionment that he thought were his own worst personal flaws, were actually the delicate yet incredibly resilient threads connecting him to the rest of humanity. The exhaustion of Elias was not a unique weakness, but rather a shared echo, a part of the symmetry breaking taking place on a global scale, where millions of other people were also struggling day and night inside the splendid glass cages of modern pressure. When he stubbornly hugged his pain and locked himself in self-judgment, he had severed himself from that grand network of empathy, becoming a meaningless drifting speck of dust instead of realizing he was an important node in the overall picture of life. The concept of that cosmic spider web seeped into the awareness of Elias like a warm ray of light, melting the thick ice of loneliness that had encased his heart for so long. For the first time, he felt a profound connection, not through achievements or fame, but through the very cracks and very human weaknesses of his own, realizing that under this vast sky, no pain is truly solitary. Looking deep into the seemingly empty, endlessly magnificent darkness through the telescope lens, where there appeared to be absolutely no light source, Evelyn began using her warm voice to unravel the final veil of ignorance obscuring the inner vision of Elias Vance. She slowly explained that those giant, pitch-black voids were actually the sturdiest pedestals for the entire structure of the vast universe, where there existed a grand concept that astronomers call the cosmic web. Billions of years ago, when all things began to expand, galaxies were not scattered randomly and disjointedly in the aimless void, but were attracted to, rooted in, and anchored to massive invisible structures. The space-time tiers, the primordial cosmic strings that seemed like flaws of the Big Bang, twisted and braided tightly together, knotting into countless intricate intersections spanning across tens of billions of light-years, creating a massive gravitational pull so that matter could rely on them to build up the light of the stars. Amidst the quiet space of the misty cliffs, Evelyn turned to look straight at the man. Carrying immense brokenness within him, gently pointing out a supremely enlightening truth that human consciousness is woven with an identical, tightly knit network. The bitter disillusionment, the extreme panic, and the absolute exhaustion that Elias was bearing were by no means proof of personal weakness or a shameful failure that needed to be hidden. Modern society, with the frantic rhythm of consumerism and brutal invisible pressures, has brainwashed us with a toxic illusion, forcing us to believe that each individual is a lonely island having to fight a life-or-death battle in an endless race. We have been injected with a false belief that inner fatigue is an abnormal disease, a terrible software bug that must be covered up with flashy material armor or echoing job titles. But through the clairvoyant lens of philosophy and the connection of the cosmic web, Elias began to realize that the bleeding cracks in his soul had never stood alone. The sharp pain in his chest was exactly a vibrational frequency in tune with millions of other living beings gasping for air in sky-high office glass boxes, people who were also trading their natural breath day and night for illusionary numbers on financial reports. His despair was the shared echo of a humanity groaning under the weight of absurd expectations that they themselves hallucinated and imposed on one another. As the illusion of absolute separation was gradually demolished by this majestic truth, Elias felt an unprecedented warm vitality weaving deep into his freezing veins. He no longer saw himself as a broken machine discarded on the runway of success, but recognized himself as a powerfully vibrating node within a giant network of the most sacredly human pains and desires. Anxiety was no longer a lonely ghost chasing to swallow him, but had become an invisible bridge connecting his heartbeat to the sobbing heartbeats of countless other lives sharing a human existence full of fractures. We often mistakenly believe that we must be perfect to deserve love and connection, but it is precisely the bleeding wounds, precisely the deepest hidden weaknesses, that are the most genuine materials for weaving human kinship. This profound realization was like a silent fire, patiently melting away the barren ice of loneliness and pride that had encased his heart for so many decades, leaving a mind wide open, peaceful, and ready to embrace the present with all its beautiful imperfections, opening an infinitely accommodating dimension where all suffering is seen as an inevitable part of the grand dance of survival that all things are performing together. Beneath the infinite stillness of the Big Sur night sky and the warm tolerance newly awakened by the realization of the cosmic web, the final shell of pride of Elias Vance had completely melted away, and feeling understood, Elias confessed his deepest desire if only he had a time machine to go back and make amends with Lily and save his family. That confession no longer carried the tone of an executive seeking optimization solutions for risk management, but was the desperate sob of a father and a husband drowning in an ocean of regret, yearning to salvage the years stolen by his own greed and blind pursuit of fame. In response to that genuine vulnerability, Evelyn did not rush to offer empty words of comfort about looking toward a bright future or advising him to forgive himself. Instead, with the sharp mind of someone who had peered through the stars, Evelyn spoke of the theory of using cosmic strings to bend spacetime and travel back into the past, a theoretical scenario that could tear reality apart and break the law of cause and effect. She unhurriedly explained that in the harshest mathematical equations of relativity, if one could find two cosmic strings of infinite length, bring them close together and then pull them apart at near light speed, the massive tension would tear the fabric of space, creating a tunnel allowing a person to step back to the very source of their mistakes. In a split second, the eyes of Elias flashed with a spark of instinctual clinging, as if science could truly offer him a mechanical miracle to erase all flaws, letting him once again be a man without blemish. But the calm voice of the former professor immediately extinguished that naive illusion. She pointed out that the universe never tolerates a paradox. If he truly stepped through that door to prevent the breakdown, he would create a devastating paradoxical shock, destroying his own existence in the present, shredding the veil of causality that kept this universe from collapsing into nothingness. We often torture ourselves with the vain belief that the past is a faulty source code we have the right to access and debug, arranging everything into its proper place so the present automatically becomes fulfilling. However, from the perspective of awakening, that profound regret is actually just the most sophisticated trick of the ego, a desperate struggle to refuse accepting impermanence and the cruel, irreversible flow of all things. His ego always wanted to play the role of an omnipotent God, desiring to manipulate the timeline itself to erase the stains of failure, but it failed to understand that it was exactly those painful mistakes, exactly the cruel empty space of his absence on the birthday of Lily, that were the most authentic materials which smashed his numb exterior and shaped his profound awakening right at this very moment. Stubbornly demanding a time machine, though it might sound grand and full of love, is actually the ultimate expression of denying reality, a form of mental violence he continued to inflict upon himself by constantly rejecting the present moment. The universe never operates by rewinding the tape to indulge human weakness or wash away guilt. It always glides forward with a magnificent indifference, carrying both perfect symmetry and life or death fractures. Instead of wasting life energy on the illusion of bending spacetime to patch up a shattered vase, true liberation demanded that he courageously stand firm right within this desolate present, directly facing the sharp shards of regret without seeking any miracle to rob him of the painful yet sacred lesson that existence had just bestowed upon him. Following the collapse of the time machine fantasy, Evelyn continued to skillfully use her calmness to peel away the final layers of fog shrouding the understanding of Elias Vance regarding the concept of time. She gently poured him a little more hot tea, letting the warmth spread to chase away the chill of despair, and then spoke in a deep voice resembling a hymn of the present. We constantly turn ourselves into prisoners doing hard labor within our own minds by continuously tearing the wholeness of reality into three fragmented pieces: the past, the present, and the future. She pointed out to him a tragic paradox in which humanity is always entangled, which is that the root of all stress, exhaustion, and anxiety never truly lies in external circumstances, but arises from the cruel separation between body and soul. Our physical bodies are always anchored right here, at this very present moment, strictly adhering to the laws of all things, yet our minds are stateless wanderers, constantly imprisoned in the dark dungeons of ghosts from the past or frantically running to build defensive fortresses against a future that has never existed. Elias had spent all the vitality of a brilliant executive ruminating over old mistakes, torturing himself over the image of his little daughter turning away in tears, convinced that punishing himself was a worthy way to atone for his absence. But Evelyn thoroughly exposed that illusion, asserting that extreme regret is actually just another selfish trick of the ego to maintain the hallucination of control. When we feel regret, we are implicitly declaring that we should have been able to master the situation, that our ego is so grand it could manipulate variables that have already receded deep into the past. Under the lens of a universe with no beginning and no end, the past is merely a ripple left behind the wake of a ship cutting through water. That ripple can show where the ship has been, but it possesses absolutely no power to push the ship forward. His stubborn clinging to painful memories, his relentless dissection of wounds that had already scabbed over, did not help change a single event that had occurred. It only performed one single, cruel task, which was stealing away the remaining glorious, vivid moments of the present. The image of his disappointed ex-wife or the teardrop of his daughter that he always saw whenever he closed his eyes actually no longer existed anywhere in this physical realm. They were only empty neurological afterimages, unreal ghosts that he was using his own flesh, blood, and breath of today to transfuse and nourish. His exhaustion, stretching over decades, was the exact price he had to pay for trying to use the strength of a living person to carry a corpse of the past on his back through every single day. That the teachings of Evelyn were like an invisible sword of wisdom, sharp yet full of compassion, gently slicing through the eardrum of ignorance. She invited him to perform the bravest act a living being could ever do, which was to let go of something that was already dead. To achieve true liberation, Elias did not need to beg for a miracle to bend spacetime, nor did he need to carry out exhausting interrogations of his conscience. He only needed to recognize the temporary nature of all thoughts and decisively sever the psychological umbilical cord binding him to bygone illusions. Let what belongs to yesterday rest in peace in the grave of silence, and recall all the life energy scattered in that invisible realm back to converge exactly at the heartbeat in his chest right now. Only when he accepted completely abandoning the desire to fix the past, and stopped using the past as a measuring stick for his self-worth, could he truly be fully present. Cutting off that attachment would create a transparent, pristine space in his soul, allowing him to receive the lily of today, a daughter who was also breathing the air of this very moment, not a frozen figure in the fog of his torment. Listening to those soul-piercing whispers, the feeling of his chest being crushed by a boulder for so long suddenly shattered and became incredibly light. He took a deep breath of the salty ocean breeze of the Pacific, feeling the genuine current of air filling his lungs, and for the first time after countless years lost in the gloomy labyrinths of his mind, he truly tasted the pristine, tranquil, and absolutely free flavor of someone who dares to stand firm right here, right now, ceasing all efforts to resist impermanence in order to harmonize with the miraculous dance of life happening right before his eyes. The final morning at the Big Sur cliffs arrived not with the ringing of familiar urban alarm clocks, but with the crystal-clear stillness of dawn. The thick blanket of fog that had shrouded both the space and the mind of Elias Vance over the past few days finally dissipated, giving way to the first rays of sunlight gilding the surface of the Pacific Ocean. He woke up very early, greeting the sunlight with a chest completely empty, but not the drained emptiness of someone who has lost their purpose in life, but rather the expansive space when the massive boulder of torment and regret has been permanently lifted from the heart. He stepped out of the wooden cabin, filling his lungs with the pristine, salty air, vividly feeling every smooth heartbeat circulating warm blood throughout his body. We constantly delude ourselves that peace can only be achieved after completely clearing away every trouble, destroying every negative thought, and patching every mistake into a flawless masterpiece. We tirelessly throw ourselves into major psychological overhauls, treating our being like a defective machine that needs to be installed with more advanced operating systems. But as Elias cast his gaze out over the immense ocean, recalling the cosmological lessons Evelyn had kindly imparted, another grand truth continued to bloom in his newly plowed consciousness. In the most modern and complex physical theories aiming to decode the ultimate structure of reality, scientists had discovered the concept of cosmic superstrings. In microscopic dimensions so unimaginably small that neither the naked eye nor the most sophisticated machinery could ever reach them, billions upon billions of those superstrings are constantly vibrating, twisting, and colliding with each other in a state of extreme chaos. They carry within them frantic energy levels, oscillating at countless different frequencies to construct the fundamental particles of the material world. If one only looked narrowly at each of those confined, localized perspectives, the universe would appear to be a violent, tangled mess without a single moment of rest, exactly like the human mind when submerged in trivial, anxious thoughts. However, when we step back and admire the entire macroscopic picture, when we look up at the night sky scattered with stars or quietly gaze at a galaxy floating in the vacuum, that entire grand universe always wears an appearance of silence, majesty, and absolute serenity. This earth-shattering realization swept through the soul of Elias like a warm spring breeze, illuminating the deepest, most hidden corners of human nature. He suddenly understood that his own imperfections, the waves of panic that had torn at his chest, the wrong decisions in the past, or even the fractures in his relationships, all of them were exactly like the chaotic vibrations of those cosmic superstrings at the microscopic level. We often exaggerate our personal cracks into an apocalyptic disaster, using the magnifying glass of judgment to scrutinize every agonizing blind spot and then convicting ourselves as a broken product of creation. But in reality, the chaotic vibration of emotions and those clumsy stumbles are exactly the most fundamental materials, the inevitable rhythm to weave the complete, miraculous being of a living entity. Just as the universe never needs to eliminate chaos at the quantum level to maintain its macroscopic tranquil beauty, he also did not need to force himself to become a numb, apathetic model to taste peace. The perfection of a human life has never been measured by a resume devoid of mistakes. Rather, it shines the brightest when an individual bravely embraces all their own bumps and flaws without a single trace of an inferiority complex or denial. The peace he was tasting right at this moment did not come from finding a way to fix a time machine, resolving all issues with his ex-wife, or fully making up to his little daughter, but it sprouted from the very moment he stopped treating his life as a difficult math problem needing an optimal solution. The magnificent scenery of the clearing morning mist did not give him any supernatural power to bend reality, but it handed him a hyperdimensional lens, helping him see through the noisy petty details of the ego to touch the vast tranquility of existence. There, all suffering, all joy, reunions, or separations blend equally together, creating an exquisite portrait of survival where carrying scratches is no longer a death sentence, but a sacred privilege, proving that we are experiencing a complete life. Carrying the serene quietness of the moment of enlightenment under the grand early morning sky, Elias Vance slowly walked back to the wooden cabin of Dr. Evelyn, where physical reality was patiently waiting for him. On the small table in the corner of the room, the expensive phone that had been powered off and lay silent for many days was still there, looking like a lifeless block of metal that used to be the control center of his entire empire of illusions. Instead of feeling a familiar knot in his chest as in previous times when facing this device, Elias now picked it up with incredibly calm hands. This time, he did not turn it on to check the error codes of a profit system, nor to issue dry directives to reclaim power, but rather to point a profound telescope right into the very center of the universe of his heart. We are always armed to the teeth with the most advanced communication devices on the planet, capable of sending data across oceans in just a millionth of a second, yet we use them to build fortified walls to hide our weaknesses and deny being fully present with the people we love. But now, as the fog of pride had been incinerated by the brilliant sun of the present, Elias calmly swiped the screen, searched for a single number, and called his 17-year-old daughter, Lily. The long rings of waiting in the silent space were no longer needles poking into the fear of rejection, but were simply the natural heartbeat of a heart throwing open its prison doors. When the voice on the other end answered with the hesitant, highly defensive tone of the young girl, Elias did not open with a carefully drafted speech begging for forgiveness, nor did he make grandiose promises full of situational control to patch up the image of a perfect father as the reflex of an executive handling a media crisis would dictate. He simply used a warm, deep voice, completely shedding all armor of authority to offer a sincere apology for his years of absence. He did not draw up a magnificent future plan to make amends, but only told her the most primal and heavy truth that he was here, right now, and he was listening to her with his entire being. Miraculously, the very act of completely stripping away all efforts to cling to emotionally manipulative scripts created an immense power of connection that no flowery words could fully describe. There were no tragic sobs, no bitter interrogations demanding accountability from Lily. The conversation was extremely brief yet carried a pure vibrational frequency of empathy, directly dismantling the tons of invisible barriers that had blocked the flow of love between father and daughter for so many exhausting years. When we stop viewing a broken relationship as an unfinished project that needs to be overhauled by the power of reason, when we stop using love as a tool to exchange for the validation of the ego, that love will automatically restore its original state of perfect symmetry, just like the universe at the dawn of time. The silence on both ends of the line was no longer the cold void of distance, but had become a warm, accommodating space, where the cosmic superstrings of two fractured souls found a harmonious rhythm to heal one another. Elias slowly lowered the phone, the corner of his eye welling with a radiant tear of ultimate relief, realizing that the true miracle to save humanity has never lay in inventing a crazy time machine to turn back to the past, but it always lies neatly within the courage to return to the breath of the present moment, where the purest love patiently waits for us to take off our majestic masks to return and recognize one another as human beings who are truly living. After the groundbreaking call that removed the invisible barriers with his daughter, Elias returned to the wooden cabin to pack his meager belongings. The act of folding each shirt no longer bore the hurried, frantic nature of an executive rushing against breathless stock valuation schedules, nor did it carry the despair of someone trying to escape from a ruined reality. Every gesture of his was now soaked in an unusual relaxation, a complete presence in the smallest of moments. Dr. Evelyn stood leaning against the oak door frame covered in moss, gently casting a quiet gaze to bid farewell to the stranger who had just undergone a spectacular transformation right by the edge of the abyss. She offered a soft smile full of wit and wisdom, the smile of someone who had completely understood the grand play of human life, and spoke in a deep voice to impart one final lesson before parting. She gently reminded him that the greatest trap for people in the industrial age is always deluding themselves into treating life as a complex software system filled with error codes that must be continuously detected and uninstalled. We are obsessed with having to optimize every experience, having to reach ideal performance metrics, turning earthly years into a series of grueling tests that must be passed to claim some invisible reward in a distant future. But life itself has never been a thorny problem awaiting the rough intervention of reason, nor is it an arduous journey with a fixed final destination. If the meaning of existence truly lay at the finish line, then all things would have had to rush at the most insane speed to end their lives, just like going to listen to a symphony only to wait for the sound of the final note to soar and then vanish. Instead, Evelyn invited him to view his presence in this world as a grand piece of music, a rhythmic dance of light and shadow orchestrated by creation itself. When you step out to dance, Your purpose is not to use willpower to move as fast as possible to a specific spot on the dance floor, but to fully immerse yourself in every melody playing right at that moment. He was not born and thrown into a strange, cold universe only to brace himself to fight, conquer, or manipulate it like an exiled alien. A tree gives birth to leaves. An ocean gives birth to waves, and this vast universe also gave birth to him in exactly the same natural and miraculous way. The arrogance of the intellect had imprisoned him in the bubble of an isolated ego, making him forget that he himself was a brilliant expression of this entire realm of space and time, a focal point of all things currently admiring its own extraordinary beauty through the lens of consciousness of a human being. The experience of being human with its myriad of emotions, painful stumbles, desperate fractures, or moments of ultimate transcendence are absolutely not obstacles blocking the path to perfection. They are actually original features, spontaneous, highly artistic strokes of existence. This entire cosmic play, with every grand or tiny event, inherently carries an incredibly liberal and free philosophical entertainment quality of its own. The universe is playing, incarnating into countless forms, including the form of an executive who once carried plenty of anxieties and emotional wounds but has now cast off a burden of 10,000 miles. Listening to those final words of wisdom, Elias sipped up his bag, nodding and smiling in return with a profound gratitude overflowing from the bottom of his heart. He understood completely that from this moment forward, he did not need to play the role of a proud warrior conquering the world, nor did he need to shoulder the responsibility of molding his life into a flawless masterpiece to display for the world to admire. He only needed to be a dedicated dancer, ready to step onto the stage of life every day. Calmly relaxing his shoulders, closing his eyes, and letting the grand symphony of all things guide every heartbeat, every breath, fully submerging himself in the miraculous dance of life that is constantly being born and fading away right before his eyes. The sound of the car engine rang out smoothly once again along the winding coastal road, carrying Elias Vance away from the stillness of the misty cliffs back north, heading straight into the heart of the technological gears. When San Francisco appeared before his eyes with its glass skyscrapers still as rushed and bustling as they had always been, and streams of people still tirelessly rushing back and forth chasing illusions of fame and power, the inner lens of Elias had now entirely undergone a grand transformation. He was no longer a cold machine constantly craving to hoard achievements or striving to prove himself at all costs, nor was he a trembling prisoner terrified of waves of anxiety if they suddenly crashed into his mind. He calmly smiled, embracing the dazzling busyness of the world, realizing that although he was just a tiny speck of dust, he was incredibly complete within the panoramic picture of this grand universe, proudly carrying the beautiful fractures of a human being who is truly living completely through every breath of freedom. The story of Elias is also an authentic mirror reflecting the soul of every one of us in an era overflowing with brutal, surrounding pressures. We often tend to tirelessly race until we exhaust our vitality to try and wear a flawless, perfect shell, accidentally forgetting that the very traumas, the moments of weakness, and the fractures of the past are the truest materials that shape the profoundly humane beauty of a living being. The priceless life lesson we can realize through this journey is that true peace has never laid at the finish line of an unreal perfection, but it sprouts right within the courage to accept all the imperfections of reality, allowing oneself to stumble and to fully embrace one's own dark corners. When we stop fighting our internal chaos and stop viewing life as an exhausting math problem that must be thoroughly solved, we will naturally find immense tranquility amidst the countless storms of impermanent human existence. Dear companions who are following this meditative philosophical journey together, how do you feel about the story today, and did you happen to find a reflection of yourself or draw any practical lessons to soothe the stress in your own busy reality? Please do not hesitate to leave comments sharing from the depths of your heart so we can listen, empathize, and soothe each other more amidst this hurried pace of life. If you found peace and positive healing values through the time we just spent, please press the subscribe button for our channel, and also like and share the video to give us tremendous motivation to continue bringing you many fascinating and meaningful videos every day. Wishing everyone watching this video abundant health, a truly joyful spiritual life, and the ability to fully enjoy every passing day in the purest state of peace. Goodbye and see you all again in the next videos.